presentation. Did everyone get a chance to see the slides? Some of the visuals that Gabriel put together were quite useful for me primarily, and I appreciated the technicality of the very dense chapter 2, which was called the two statements. And it's obvious that Gabriel has a strong background in mathematics, and I think that really helped all of us understand the correlation between scientific thought and thinking in interiority. So for me, at least, it really helped clarify the kind of abstract stakes, the theoretical stakes of Lazarus. Now we're moving into chapter 3. Here we are revisiting many of the same kind of themes that we saw from the get-go around periodization, around the Leninist mode, around we're moving to the present. We're moving to the conjecture of the contemporary, and we're learning quite a lot in this section. And I thought that Assad Haider would be a very good guide for many reasons. He's thought quite a lot about this, and I think that really there's nobody better to navigate us through chapter 3. So Assad, could you take about half an hour to 40 minutes for your sort of talk, which I'm assuming will also be kind of a discussion as well?
Yeah, that would be great if we could, you know,
Are you muted?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No, we can't hear you.
Yeah,
I can.
I can hear us up.
yeah, I can hear.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me, Daniel?
Now I can.
Okay.
Thank you. Go, take it away.
All right. Yeah. I hope that there will be discussion. Please interject to raise, you know, other areas of discussion, inquiries, and so on. I want to, the approach I want to take here is one which emphasizes, let's say, a rational and non-philosophical elaboration that I believe Lazarus is engaged in, which is primarily, I want to propose that as first and foremost a reflection on emancipatory politics, and it is situated within the history of emancipatory politics and its thought. So this chapter begins by quite clearly establishing that the starting premise, which elaborates, as he puts it, the validity of the anthropology of the name, is the lapsing of classism and the critique of classism. This is right at the beginning of the chapter. And so, you know, there are many steps in the argument. I don't think I'll manage to cover them all, but what he sets out at the beginning is that classism is characterized by the dialectic of the objective and the subjective. And he counterposes to this a dialectic of the subjective and the objective, which I will talk about less, but which would be an interesting theme. Now, the dialectic of the objective and the subjective has as its fundamental notion consciousness. And the dialectic of the subjective and the objective has as its fundamental notion the state. So this is announced right at the beginning of this chapter. And he also announces one thing that I will address. I won't address the reading of many of the other figures here, but I will address the reading of Althusser, which is where a lot of my background lies. And note from the outset, he makes, you know, in this his style is so funny because he says it in this very plain way that Althusser is a thinker of the subjective. Of course, you know, the whole reputation of Althusser is the critique of the subject, history as a process without a subject. So it's a really provocative statement, which he says as though it's no big deal that Althusser will be the basis for thinking the subjective. But then he gives this fascinating reason for this. Okay, and I will leave the question of history there's this description of history as the thought relation of the state. To me, it's a somewhat obscure point. Daniel and Drew can cover. But what's happening here, I think, is that Lazarus is setting out to address the intersection of a thought of singularity with that of what he's calling a historical mode of politics. And thinking the singular, and this is the whole underlying premise of the anthropology of the name, thinking the singular is very difficult because it is easy to reduce the singular to a case of the general. So the problem is how to think singularity without making it the object of thought, which would be to generalize it, and this constitutes for him a scientistic approach. So he posits this thesis, which has been consistent, which is that politics is of the order of the subjective. Now, to understand part of what's at stake here, we can contrast it to the objectal approach he describes, which conflates politics with institutions like the party or structures like the state. These are two examples he gives of an objectal approach, which would be contrary to thinking politics at the order of the subjective. And so he says, politics, this is 72, politics is not a societal invariant that lends itself to the analysis of power. Rather, politics is a thought. And this establishes its sequential character. That is, it's not a societal invariant, but something which happens, begins and ends, and is thus sequential. And that allows us to hypothesize about it without reducing it to the state, economics, or history, okay? And so the statement, I'll read the quotation, pages 72 to 73, there is no such thing as politics in general, only singular political sequences. Politics is not a permanent instance of societies, it is rare and sequential, and is manifested in historical modes. And the mode, he says, is the relation of a politics to its thought. Okay, so this question has come up before, which is, you know, it's been framed in different ways. How do we know that a mode has lapsed, and so on? So he poses the question of how we identify a mode. And he says a mode, and this is 73, a mode begins and ends. It marks the sequence of existence of politics. The work of identifying the mode involves delimiting the sequence and dating it. The dating is in itself a complex question that will involve the category of sites of politics. In effect, every historical mode of politics displays particular places, and the disappearance of the place signifies the end of the sequence of the given mode. So it's already logically posited from the outset that when we are talking about historical modes of politics, that they have ended. They are sequences that began and then ended. So the question of how we identify the ending of the mode, that's at a different level. That question is just at a different level of analysis, because already from the beginning, once we have been able to identify a mode, that means that it ended. It began and ended. It was a sequence, okay? I have a note here to myself to check the word place and compare it to the word site in French, but I didn't do that. But I can do it. I can try and flip through and find it if this comes up. Okay, but now we get, I think it's, you know, he alludes to different modes already, and he gives different points about the analysis of the different modes, but in this chapter, he lays them out. All of the modes that he discusses in their entirety, he lays them out sequentially and explains their relations. And he distinguishes between a mode in interiority, in which case he says there is a homogeneous multiplicity of sites, which means that from the beginning of the book, we know that this homogeneous multiplicity means thinking the subjective within the subjective. That is, the political subjectivity understood on its own terms, rather than through reference to an object. And so this would be in contrast to a mode in exteriority, which means for him always that they have the state as their locus. That's his wording. So he goes through first the modes and interiority. Now, I think this is like, this raises a question about periodization. It raises questions about history, which he goes into. I will just say this as a way of thinking about the modes, because it's, you know, it's kind of like when you read Badiou and it seems like there were like 4 events in history. And here, you know, he just lists 4 modes. I don't think that this is, that the kind of analysis he's presenting is one which would be an exhaustive periodization or a way of capturing the historical totality or a historical dialectic in its progression. I think these are just, as he, to use a turn of phrase he has at the beginning, theses of existence. That is, these modes happened. It's a there is statement. It does not mean that, you know, it's one of his interesting interpreters, Ernest Wamba has an article in which he helpfully lays out a table. Maybe I can post the image. He lays out a table of the historical modes of politics for Lazarus. And then he follows it with another table, which is the historical modes of politics in the Congo. So he gives an entirely different list of historical modes of politics. And I think, you know, once again, since this is a statement of there is, there need be no claim to exhaustiveness. But what has to be understood is the relationship between these modes. So first there's the revolutionary mode, which goes from 1792 to 1794. And this is not explained in much depth in this section. It comes up a little bit later in understanding history, and it's explored at length in the first study at the end of the book, which is included like an appendix, which is his article on the French Revolution. So I won't go any further into the revolutionary mode because it's not explained yet. But as I indicated already, the classist mode is really decisive for understanding his whole method. So the classist mode is key here. He dates the classist mode from 1848 to 1871. And this is the moment framed by the Communist Manifesto to the Paris Commune. And in the classist mode, he says, history is the category in consciousness of politics. He says, this is page 73, history is understood here as the product of the class struggle and is manifested in the development of the working class movement. Now, he distinguishes this insofar as the classist mode is a mode of politics. He distinguishes it from the kind of analysis, or let's say a descriptive analysis, which would be that of historical materialism. And he says, rather, it's a category of consciousness and hence a prescriptive category. So just to kind of lay out my interpretation, you know, what's decisive in the Communist Manifesto that explains his points is that in the Communist Manifesto, the political subject of the proletariat is understood as the expression of historical laws. And so the historical laws of development, and they're trans-historical laws of development of the productive forces, within capitalist societies, workers are brought together in factories and in towns, and in their common situation, they form a consciousness of their exploitation. And this consciousness is the basis for a political subjectivity which will overturn capitalism. So historical laws lead to consciousness, which is the basis of the political subject of the proletariat. This, I believe, is the fundamental aspect of the classist mode. Now, Lazarus says, and this is on page 74, that with the Paris Commune, he says the categories of working class movements or historical movements were exhausted. What I take this to mean is that the Paris Commune, which represented for Marx the example of proletarian revolution, of the constitution of forms of life that were after the capitalist state. This resulted by accident rather than from the historical laws determining the workers' movement. It is the accidental result of the war and the agency of a wide range of social groups, artisans, and so on. And it was not just the historical laws determining the industrial proletariat as the coming to consciousness, which would be the political subject. This is my interpretation of Lazarus's account of the classist mode of politics. Now, classism is more complicated than this because, and this goes back to the letter to Wedemeyer that Daniel brought up at the beginning, which is that Lazarus argues that classism is not specific to Marx, but is rather part of a whole range of bourgeois thought which precedes Marx, which is part of French historiography and so on. And so Marx has this unusual position, which, he says that he did not discover the existence of classes, but rather the fact that the class struggle would lead to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the progression to a communist society. So there is a classist mode of politics, which is a mode of politics in interiority associated with Marx, but there is also classism as a broader conception which he associates with scientism. Okay, now, this is the classist mode. It's followed by the Bolshevik or Leninist mode. Now, this is dated from 1902, which is what is to be done, to 1917, which is what comes after the October Revolution. And this is a break from the classist mode. I think this is an extremely interesting and original interpretation of Lenin and Leninism, which is what Lazarus calls the thesis of politics under condition. And this dissociates Leninism from the institution of the party, as we've already seen. The idea, I'll quote on page 74, he says, proletarian political capacity is not spontaneous, historical, or socially determined. It is obliged to state its own conditions. There is a gap between a conception in which politics is expressive of the social and one in which it is subject to condition. So, while the classist mode saw consciousness and political subjectivity as the expression of historical laws, the Leninist mode sees consciousness as something which is not given by historical laws, but affirmatively posited by the party. Politics only exists under these conditions which are affirmative, not spontaneous, and not determined by history and not an expression of given social conditions, the gathering of workers in the factory. The gathering of workers in the factory leads to a trade union consciousness, and it does not spontaneously, for Lenin, lead to the emancipatory politics. And so the party is a site of politics, not due to its institutional structure, but because, in his words, it's the protocol of this gap between the social and the political. Now, the Bolshevik mode also takes on another site. It's not just the party, but in the movement between 1902 to 1917, we see another site emerge, which is the Soviet. And so these are the two sites of politics in the Leninist mode. But after the October Revolution, the party becomes the state, and the Soviets are subordinated to the party state, and thereby lapse as a site of politics. And that's the end of the Bolshevik mode. Then we have the dialectical mode, which goes from 1928 to 1958. In some ways, to me, this is the most obscure mode. And he emphasized, and perhaps it's the most obscure because to some extent it determined his primary political vantage point for so long. And he emphasizes at this point that this mode has a proper name, which is Mao. And of course, there are also proper names which correspond to the previous modes. Saint-Just, usually Saint-Just, also Robespierre for the revolutionary mode, Marx and Engels for the classist mode, and Lenin for the Bolshevik mode. And the proper name, I think, for him is a way of thinking the singularity of the mode. That is, its non-generalizability in the proper name that is at its core. Now, he says the dialectical mode subordinates history to the masses and foregrounds, he says, such subjective notions as enthusiasm for and socialism. I don't have much more to say about this mode, but I will note that he does not mention here the Cultural Revolution as another mode which could follow this one. And I think that this is, it is useful to consider the Cultural Revolution as filling in this history Badiou has written elsewhere, employing some of the language, that the Cultural Revolution is the moment of the saturation of the party state. So it is not already, that process is not complete in Russia, but it happens with the Cultural Revolution because that is, in Badiou's words, the last revolution which is internal to the model of the party state. And after that,
Assad, he says that in the history chapter as well, that then the brief period of 1966 with the factory subjectivations, that's the last time that the factory was made. Firstly, it starts a new sequence because that's when the factory becomes the first time a political site, but it's also the end of the party state, because the factory is subsumed under the party state, which then means that it no longer has that capacity anymore of a distance from the state. So he agrees with that Badiou point from later on. He says it later in the next chapter.
Yeah. Okay, so those are the modes in interiority, and then we have his list of the modes in exteriority, which means, I'll quote him on page 75, a mode in exteriority is a thought of politics that argues in its statements that politics is not thinkable or is not thinkable from within itself, but that the thought of politics, if one does exist, requires at least one external referent, such as economy or law. In this way, the thought of politics is subordinated to that of the state. Okay. Now, there are two modes in exteriority that he identifies, and one is the parliamentary mode, which begins in 1968, and it's not entirely clear to me whether he thinks it has ended. And this is characterized, he says, by the functional and consensual form of the state, which is distinct from parliamentary regimes which may have existed before. So he says, this is the, page 75 to 6, this is the intensification of the governmental and non-representative character of parties, and it's characterized by the role of public opinion. On 76, he says, the state can be said to be functional when it no longer pretends to be representative of the social body and is identified by clear evidence of technicality and its related constraints. So that's the functional aspect of the state, technocracy and so on. The consensual corresponds to the functional in the sense that it presents forms of consciousness of the functional state. And it, this is 76, reduces its separate, inaccessible, repressive, and authoritarian aspect to convey and emphasize the restrained and constrained space of the field of consciousness. So this functional and consensual character of the parliamentary mode means, in some sense, devolving the political aspects of the state towards the economy, and then presenting the functional aspect of the state in terms of moral values. So, key thing, really a very fascinating statement to me is that this mode denies that politics is a thought and instead reduces it to an opinion on the government. This is his description of this mode. And so political parties, it says on page 77, are responsible for organizing in subjectivity that the only possible political thought is an opinion regarding the government. Okay. The next mode in exteriority is the Stalinist mode, which he says begins in the early 30s and ends in 1985. And this is the mode which is centered on the party state, which he says evacuates the economy. That is, that the economy ceases to exist because it's entirely subordinated to the party state. And this mode is terroristic. I think he means it's just in a technical sense, because there is no norm or referent of politics which is outside the party state. Okay, so just to review here the key distinction, which is the one between classism and Leninism, which is, to review, the classist dialectic of the objective and the subjective is the Marxist thesis that the material conditions of existence determine forms of consciousness. This is the way that historical laws are the basis of political subjectivity. And as I mentioned, Marxism is not identical to classism, but is situated within classism. And it's confusing in some ways because it seems that classism is characterized as being both in interiority as a mode of politics, but also in exteriority in the sense that he says it involves a direct mapping of intellectuality onto exterior reality. That's on page 78. I think what this brings us to is what he describes as circulating notions or circulating categories. And that is when a category circulates between the orders of the objective and the subjective. Class and consciousness in the classist problematic are of both orders. That is, they're part of the objective description of the social structure, and they are categories of political subjectivity, and thus circulate between both orders. And so he says on 79, consciousness is at once at the order of the objective. It is determined by material conditions of existence, and of the order of the subjective. It develops into a thought of history and a view of the world. And he says class pertains at once to a problematic of the subjective, consciousness of class, and to a problematic of the objective, relations of production underpin class. And so this is not a philosophical dialectic involving negation and so on for Lazarus, but it's rather a circulation. And that's the basis of the idea of totality. I won't really get into that. So the Leninist break is when consciousness is located in the party and is therefore not determined by historical laws. And he proceeds here to a very condensed critical analysis of Leninism, which he says, there is what he characterizes as a reversibility between the subjective and the objective, which is crystallized in the program, and the relation of the party to the program. I think, once again, this is an obscure point, which maybe others have more insight into. And so, yeah, okay. Right, okay, so, and this Leninist breakthrough, which dissociates consciousness from history, he adds, still makes consciousness a consciousness of. That is, a consciousness of an object, which leads it to the state. And for Lazarus, the historical mode of politics is an alternative to thinking in terms of consciousness. He lays this out on page 84. Now, this is a very difficult analysis because the categories of the anthropology of the name are being generated by the very historical sequences which it is setting out to understand. So there's a constant back and forth movement here, which is difficult to follow. And I won't address the analysis of Foucault, and I don't want to talk much more. And the issue of totality and so on, I think, is more tied to the analysis of history that others will get into. Just some points on Althusser, and there are other people who also can speak about the analysis of Althusser in a very interesting way. Althusser is a thinker of totality and social description in Lazarus's analysis, but he's also a thinker of the subjective. And I would say, coming at it from the vantage point of studying Althusser, it brings out a great dilemma in Lazarus's thought, which is that he wants to think the irreducibility of subjectivity to social foundations. Yet it's impossible to not in some way describe the social totality in order to specify and characterize this subject. And this is the great, I think, kind of irresolvable tension in Lazarus's thinking. He says that Althusser, in the essay Contradiction and Overdetermination, is thinking at two levels. And the first level is the level of the instance of the social structure. The economy is an instance, the law is another instance, and so on. And then of totality, and the totality is overdetermined in the sense that everything is not reducible to the same instance, but that different instances take on the structuring role in different moments. That's the first level. And then the second level, he says, is the level of contradiction. And so this leads him to the source material of Mao. And he says Mao's argument in On Contradiction, once again, there are two levels. There is an argument about principal and secondary contradictions, and then principal and secondary aspects of contradictions. The first is the analytical. That's the level of analysis and description, the materialist description of the situation, which identifies the principal contradiction, which is structuring the other instances. The second, he says, is prescriptive, determining the principal and secondary aspects of contradiction, because it is a taking of a position on what is possible in the situation. That is what is implied by identifying the principal aspect of a contradiction. Let's say between an oppressed nation and imperialism. So now, according to Lazarus, Althusser unites in the concept of overdetermination the analytical and descriptive level and the prescriptive level. And so there are two theses, Lazarus says, with which Althusser refutes both Stalinist scientism and Marxist humanism. And so the first thesis is that the economy does not determine all other instances. Now, the risk here is that you can just devolve all of the instances into a kind of state of disorder in which you cannot analyze them at all. But the second thesis is, and he says what this second thesis is not. The second thesis is not that politics is of the order of the subjective, which is Lazarus's thesis. Althusser does not make this thesis, but he says Althusser also does not deny it. But Althusser makes it thinkable by showing that politics can't be reduced to the political or the order of institutions because of the overdetermination of instances. So overdetermination makes it possible to think the relationship of instances in a way which is not either, he says, mechanistic expressivity in the aggregation of instances, the reduction of everything to one instance, or Lazarus's words 99, their distribution in an irreconcilable multiple. And so there is overdetermination by a particular instance, but without one instance being what all other instances can be reduced to, and therefore politics is irreducible to the economic. And this makes it possible to think in terms of political subjectivity. That's what I've got.
Wonderful. So let's pause for comments, questions, any clarification. I struggled with this, Assad, around the two levels within overdetermination and how the prescriptive fit. I think I understood it better from Mao than I did from Althusser in the split within the principal contradiction, and how sort of there's a kind of a thesis of excess, there's a sort of remainder, and that remainder is a sort of the side of the prescriptive, something like that. Other thoughts before we move? I'm gonna move into all of this business on totality and how he finishes chapter 3. And then I'm going to give you all a PowerPoint, if you don't mind, just in part because I think it's a little easier to visualize a lot of this stuff. Can you all see that okay? Good? Good. Okay. So I think one of the really interesting things which Assad just touched on is this notion of the functional state. And I believe that the very interesting thing about the book at this point is that we have somewhat of a chronology. You know, we have somewhat of a sort of bringing it all home, sort of say, what can we say about the contemporary political conjecture? And I think one of the things that we most definitely can say is that politics finds itself sort of confronting what he calls the functional state. And I think this had different iterations, but it is perhaps now very much pronounced. It is definitely, as Assad said, a sort of politics in exteriority. What I found interesting is that it sort of functions on a notion of the relationship between capital and the state. And Lazarus is insisting on a kind of non-autonomous reading of capital. Rather, he's insisting on a fundamental linkage, a fundamental unity, which I don't think is perhaps too controversial for most Marxists. I think this is a pretty much an orthodox line. However, what I want to draw your attention to is the way in which a whole number of movementist and sort of third way ideologisms, which we looked at in the first and second chapter, also come to reproduce a contestation of capital and get somehow sucked up into this consensual site. And so the site of the consensual I've written here is the primary site which organizes politics and exteriority. And I would point folks to the opening of Badiou's Logics of Worlds, where he makes this very nice syllogism around what you might call contemporary ideology in the form of what he calls democratic materialism. So I think a way to think the consensual is also a way to think Badiou's sort of broader injunction that contemporary thought only relies on language and bodies, but excludes thought. So there's a sort of fundamental exclusion of the category of thought within this consensual site. So the side of the consensual, as I've said before, is thinking this sort of autonomous relationship of capital in the state. It's thinking a kind of false two. It's thinking a false separation of them. I think that obviously populism in its contemporary iteration is operating at the side of the consensual, no doubt. And obviously what he calls movementism is doing the same. One sort of side question I had for you all was and if anyone has any thoughts on this, I'd appreciate it. Sort of, what do you make of the notion that when you think of the notion of the consensual, you think of an arrangement which is of domination, or which necessitates authority? Yet, is it not the case since 2008, the side of the consensual is in complete disarray, right? And so I'm trying to locate a certain theory of fascism within this space of the consensual. So perhaps that's something for further consideration. What I think is important is in this, now I'm moving more to the abstract, taking a step back. And before I introduce totality, I think it's really important that we break down these two levels of the dialectic. He says that there's a certain tendency within Marxist thought, especially within the Leninist mode, to derive a movement of the dialectic from the objective contradictions to the subjective being the thought of people or the position of the proletariat. This is what derived determination. But determination is not a dialectical site for Lazarus. What is what he calls operation. And so he's sort of making an axiomatic claim here, and he's wanting to say that in his revision of the classist dialectic, we must begin from the subjective so that we can derive what he calls operations or operators. And operators are names. Operators are things like class, party. They are names, and we know that names are what generate sites. So they have an efficacious relationship to the generation for sites where thinkability can occur. So the subjective, therefore, is primary. I think that's very important. On this point of reversibility, I think what he's saying about Lenin is that Lenin was so successful because Lenin was able to somehow perform a clean correspondence from the objective back into the subjective. Lazarus, in some sense, wants to split that on its head, or to turn it the other way and to begin from the subjective. I've written here that his interest is in a subjective form of politics, which is establish new operators. So I think that becomes clear as we look into chapter 4 on unnameable names, because unnameable names sort of becomes this sort of the broader point for thinking politics at a kind of non-local level, let's say. I mean, you can think unnameable names within the side of a factory, but he's also thinking about this category of unnameable names, I think, from a historical point of view. So it's a slightly sort of broader point of view. I've written here that the subjective only finds itself relating to operators once it undergoes reversibility. So I think that we have to ask ourselves, what does Lazarus mean by reversibility? I would actually claim that he is turning Leninism on its head, and because he's beginning with the subjective. I would also say, before I get to totality, that I believe Lazarus is making a very interesting claim about the status of operators, which are sort of efficacious names that can have circulation and produce contradictions and so on. He's making a claim that we don't have them, which is why the workers' anthropology must begin afresh, or must begin anew. In other words, it's why he puts an emphasis on place over site, because he wants to generate something more originary. And I'll have more sort of to say on that in the future. So totality obviously has a long tradition going back to Hegel. And one of the best thinkers of totality, of course, is Lukács. Lukács is not mentioned too much, but he's certainly a thinker for whom consciousness had a correspondence vis-a-vis a worldview of the proletariat, that the proletariat through revolutionary action is capable of possessing a unique orientation to the totality. And this is not Lazarus's view at all, because for Lazarus, something like that Lukácsian reading would absolutely be a reproduction or a sort of danger of reproducing objectal thought. And Lazarus also says quite clearly that totality in Marxism really has always, in some sense, had a correspondence to the state, or always somehow leads back to a statist objectification. Whereas in non-objectal thought, or thought in interiority, the totality begins an opening to thinking, begins an opening to the anthropology of the name. So the totality, and this is an interesting point on Althusser, which Assad sort of mentioned. I have this quote, I'll just read this, says, if class struggle is expressive of instances, and in particular of economics, then politics does not have its own field, and the subjective does not exist. Althusser's enterprise emerges as an attempt against and after Stalin to propose a compatibility between politics and Marxism, even if it means overhauling the latter. So I really felt that what was novel, and this is something Assad didn't mention, about Lazarus's reading of Althusser, and I think I'm not a great reader of Althusser myself. I've read some of his works, but is what was really struck me was the way in which Althusser is a Stalinist revisionist. In other words, what motivated the Althusserian project, although not exclusively, unlike Lazarus and Badiou, was really much more so an attempt to treat the horror of Stalinism. And I think that Lazarus makes a claim that Althusser was quite successful in this. So that sort of closes down chapter 3. And we're now moving into chapter 4. And again, if there's any comments or questions, just jump in at any point. You don't need to, I can't look at the chat and do this presentation. So we have two historians that are invoked, Finley and Bloch. Now, Bloch is an interesting figure. He's a sort of French historian who is actually like a kind of very fascinating. He was not a communist, he was a socialist, but he was a sort of martyr against the Nazis. And he developed a sort of thesis which was structural in orientation. So was Finley's. And so Lazarus is not committed to all of their conclusions as historians, and they are theoretical historians. I mean, Bloch is one of the most important historians as part of the Annales movement with Braudel and others. He wrote an incredible book about medieval history, and what they both emphasize is overall a kind of subjective centric narrative of history, or that what's novel about historiography and historicism is precisely the location of exceptional modes of existence, and the way in which, although it's not nearly as formalized as Lazarus, subjectivity is present within its own historical context. And so he says on page 103 that for Bloch, consciousness is connected to the mediation of time. And so I want to get into a little bit about what he means by time in Bloch, because I've read the historian's craft, but I found it actually quite dry. I did not really connect with the text. It was not of strong interest to me. In other words, I think I get the novelty of Bloch for Lazarus, but I have not derived something of a profound a feeling when I read Bloch as Lazarus does. Duncan, who's not here with us, he's actually at the beach, has written, I think 3 or 4 pages of really nice, sort of an essay, really, with secondary literature citations. He's really gone above and beyond on what the meaning of Bloch is for Lazarus. So this is posted in the Slack, and I'm happy to share it. So the basic idea here is that for Bloch, and here we're getting into the kind of very fascinating metaphysics of time. You'll remember that Lazarus makes a point that when people think, and when you have a prescription, or when you have a set of utterances that are in the mode of a future anterior, that people have a new space of time that opens, whereby what will come is fundamentally open, where there's a different orientation of possibility to the future. And so in Bloch's conception, as I understand it, again, I'm not a Blochian, I'm not really a partisan of Bloch per se, but in his conception, you have the thesis of the irreversibility of the past, that the past must be seen as that which has occurred, as a irreversible there is. And then you have a relationship to the present, and then you have a relationship to the future. And I think what's most interesting for Bloch, as well as for Lazarus, is that history is punctuated by moments where there is a subjective break with time as such. Now, one point of reference here to understand this bigger theme on time and temporality is Badiou's own work in Being an Event. For Badiou, what you have in general is a thesis of time which is localized to situations, and that subjects or subjectivities become the possessors of time. So time as such is no longer a chronos or a chronological time, nor is it this kind of ion version of time. You may be familiar with these two distinctions of time in philosophy. Rather, time is on the side of the subject, right? So a groupsicle, a revolutionary group, a group which is in possession of a particular novelty within a particular mode, subtracts themselves from historical time. And so this is a big theme for Badiou. I know some of you guys have read Badiou. Any questions on time? Or Dhruv, do you want to jump in with any reflections at this point? I know you've probably studied Bloch a bit.
No, I mean, I haven't read Bloch, but is there other comments? And then, because like we've done a lot, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
So maybe people have something to say, and then we can move on to the last part of the chapter.
Sure. Yeah, please jump in with clarifying questions or with I think the key thing here is that Bloch is giving Lazarus. What is Bloch giving to Lazarus? He's giving to Lazarus a way to think the novelty of the subjective as the logic of what periodizes history, and that logic resides within the thought of people, within locations, within specific situations. So all of a sudden, this is highly compatible with Lazarus's whole wider project. And so Bloch gives Lazarus quite a lot. Maybe we need to go back and read Bloch in more detail to fully appreciate the significance of his model, but he still says that ultimately he remains committed to a structuralist project. So if he had a politics, it would still be an exteriority. It's not as subjective as Lazarus is aiming for. So other comments? Let me see if we have a group comment or chat comment.
So let's start with page 115.
Okay.
And the concept of the polysemy of time.
Yeah.
So
I get to that in a moment.
Yeah, so here the question at issue is no longer the state, but rather the polysemy of time.
Right.
So now, this is not the first time he's introduced a polysemical conception. So the first time we see a polysemical conception in, and this is a basic process operator, conceptual operator for Lazarus is polysemy. So the first time we see it is page 54.
Yeah.
So if you go, so at page 53, page 54, we have the idea of the two statements. You know, statement one, people think, and statement two, thought is a relation of the real. So now those are basic, those are simple concepts. Now, on page 54, he introduces these two statements have two corresponding processes. There is thought, that which is thought in thought. The minute you go from statement one to process one, you've made a polysemical move in time. Not in time, in relation to that, in relation to those statements. So it's what we call a linear polysemy. So it's when it goes from, so the move here is away from structuralist linguistics, specifically the language of Saussure with signifier and signified. And what you're moving to here is a field of structuralist linguistics and the idea of semantics. So the move of the polysemical is a movement from a statement to its process. So now when it comes back to the idea of Bloch, the thing with Bloch is that Bloch actually has two levels of polysemy in his work. The problem that he has with Bloch is that Bloch is actually unable to traverse those two sites. And that's where all of the reconstruction work that he does is got to do with that. So that's why, for example, he says it's got to do, he talks about two forms of heterogeneous multiplicities.
Right.
And that's got to do with the two types of time one can talk about. And that's got to do with time in its interior and time in the exterior.
Yeah. I have this.
So go for it.
I have this nice little breakdown. So I thought it would be interesting for us to ask what is a multiplicity for Lazarus, and he actually defines it pretty specifically as, quote, a concrete mode of being of the category as evidenced by several modes of politics. And then he says there's two types of multiplicities, heterogeneous and homogeneous. And so I've put the characteristics of heterogeneous versus homogeneous multiplicities. Now we know that Lazarus is aiming for a politics in interiority, which is sort of an achievement of a homogeneous multiplicity, right? So there is in heterogeneous multiplicities a few very interesting points. Number one, this goes back to the theme on time. If Bloch and Finley, and remember Finley, as a side point I neglected to mention, is very famous and very sort of heterodox Marxist historian, although he's kind of a Marxist liberal. I've read secondary essays on his politics just as an aside. He was kind of a direct democracy Marxist. And part of that was because he underwent a very traumatic experience of academic McCarthyism. But nonetheless, his thesis in the Ancient Economy in Greece, his seminal text, was that at the subjective level, the Greek economy was not the site. They didn't really have the economy in a formal sense as a kind of separate autonomous zone that determined life in the way that we talk about it within the capitalist mode, just as an aside. So you can see immediately some resonance why Finley might be of interest to Lazarus. But nonetheless, heterogeneous multiplicities are not founded in time. In other words, they're not founded in the subject. whereas homogeneous multiplicities are founded in time. And again, time, the subject is in possession of time. There is a kind of important genealogy to be done on this wider theme of subjective time and Marxist thought. You know, we don't have the time to go into it now, but I just will say as an aside, I'm reading the psychobiography of Nietzsche, and I hope you all realize that Nietzsche stole his very notion of eternal return, which is his thesis of time, from Blanqui, the famous communist of the Paris Commune, Socrates of the Paris Commune. And there's completely different ends sought in this notion of the irreversibility of time for Nietzsche, as there is for Blanqui, and as there is all the way up into Lazarus. And one of the sort of important points is that subjectivity possesses a sort of autonomous orientation to time. So that's just an interesting aside. But hopefully this kind of helps you think a little bit more about what we mean by a homogeneous versus a heterogeneous multiplicity. Obviously, one way could map heterogeneous onto a form of objectal politics, and homogeneous onto non-objectal would be one way to do it. But like all great arguments, it seems to me that Lazarus is deriving a thesis, which is that the only type of emancipatory politics worth speaking of or worth doing is one that would drive a politics in interiority, right? He's sort of making that, I think, broader claim. But let me go back here and make a comment. In order to understand our current conjecture, he wants us to separate from history. Now, on the one hand, we know from Lenin that Lenin, as Assad said, separated from the Marxist mode of history. And that separation evolved the mode, the wider revolutionary mode. And at our conjecture, at the end of the Leninist mode, in its saturation, I think Lazarus is trying to do something similar and to derive a different pivot into a politics that would begin an anthropology of the name. Again, this notion of origin or beginning is very significant in the wider idea of separation, because what separation allows is the space of interiority. So I think that's a significant theme. I also wanted to flag what Chris put in the notes. And Chris, I would love for you to jump in here, because I know, Chris, you had some questions about this notion of the unicity of time. This is a very fascinating point. And what I take unicity of time to mean is very similar to Badiou's work in Being an Event, around a mode of intervention on behalf of militants within a concrete situation that would be an inquiry, that would be seeking that which in the situation is most unrepeatable. In other words, the unicity of time is the status of time when it is subjected to the method of saturation. I don't know if that makes sense. And then I've tried to limit my definition of saturation to identifying what in this situation is unrepeatable. And I think when we get to the workers' anthropology and we get very practical and we roll up our sleeves and we get out of the high theory, we'll see how that works. And then we can then locate time within that worker factory situation. And polysemy, on the other hand, can be seen as a contrast point to the unicity of time, because it is what organizes a confusion or an indecision. So therefore, polysemy is similar to what Badiou means by atonality. Because you see, Peter Hallward has a wonderful article where he creates a number of principles of what he calls prescriptive politics, which is the politics of Lazarus and Badiou. And one of them was that a prescriptive politics insists on cleansing a situation of indecision. And you know Lenin's famous comment that nothing is worse than vacillation, nothing is worse than indecision. So polysemy is a certain orientation which creates a paralysis within a situation. That's how I read it. Again, jump in with points, and anybody can jump in at any point.
Daniel, can you just talk about this concept of situation a little bit more? It was sort of striking to me, just as the concept of totality sort of brings up a whole sort of loaded history of Marxist theory. Situation is also a profoundly kind of loaded term. And so, you know, there was sort of passing reference, I think, in chapter 1 to Sartre. I think we have juxtaposed somewhere in chapter 1 Sartre and Althusser as sort of two kind of polar figures. And then there's the discussion of situation that comes up in chapter 3. I found striking, interesting, elusive, raised for me the sort of obviously existentialist lineage, and yet I don't necessarily know that that's the reference here. And then particularly sort of in that discussion of situation that is introduced on 93, we get on 95 this reference to, at the bottom of 95, the strength of character, the strength of character that can support and face the uninterrupted protocol of the real, to be what it is.
Right.
If by strength of character, what we understand is the strength of a thought whose determination does not.
So I love that passage.
Yeah.
I love that passage because I take that to mean that the mode of address, the mode of the location of naming, of a naming procedure. And I have done something which may be helpful for us, is I've mapped the two processes onto the unnameable names on this slide. But I kind of try to take it in like a sequence, as I read the sequence, right? And all I mean by situation is the same as a factory, a mode of investigation, right? He says very clearly that people think has to begin also with the decision of investigation into people think. Okay, you say people think, then where are you going to go investigate that, right? So I think there has to be that connection, and that's all I mean by situation. I don't mean it in I mean it in a broader sense. It's my own term. Does that make sense? I think a place would be synonym here for situation, you know? So, but I take that point at the bottom of 95 to be a beautiful ethical point. When Badiou says that ethics is around this Lacanian maxim of the persistence to follow one's desire to the end, if interiority introduces, and it's kind of interesting that a thinking interiority allows the group, the people that are thinking it, to become associated with an elsewhere. And that elsewhere becomes a sort of, well, ultimately a site, you know? And so there's a very beautiful point around the singularity, which we also need to discuss, because the relationship between how the sequencing of a naming procedure reaches a point of singularity, and at that point you have the unnamability of the name. And to me, again, we're introduced to a kind of unsaid ethical overture. That is something I really want to develop the next time that we meet. And what I mean by that is Lazarus's critique of politics and exteriority are that they are naming their procedure with categories like consciousness or history, etc. And that itself produces, I don't know, something violent and so on. And the name for that is Stalin, that he gives to that, right? Anyways, other thoughts? I wonder if Chris wanted to jump in on some of this business.
I'd rather not. I appreciate that. I just posed the question because I was lost. But thank you for
Sure.
dedicating a slide, at least partially, to it.
No worries. Drew, did you want to make any interventions going back to what you were talking about before?
Sure. Maybe we could go a little bit, because the thing with the time is that he's actually, like, this entire first section is a demonstration of the of the moves you kind of have to make to do the workers' anthropology. And so what you're going to see in this chapter, at least in my opinion, is you basically see three examples given to you of what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So while he's trying to forward his argument. So the three examples which he's going through are, first is time, then is the factory, and then the other one is also the party.
Yeah.
And the reason he gives those three is just because each one of those gives him subject material. So the reason so what you have to start with is the question of time being polysemic. So now time is polysemic for him on two registers, and I don't know how many people here have ever seen like a structuralist, like I've ever seen Levi Strauss's structuralist work of myths, for example. Has anyone seen that before? So typically what Levi Strauss will do is he will start constructing matrices. So Mitra, Varuna, which is the famous one which Deleuze and Guattari pick up. That opposition of Mitra and Varuna can be traced in multiple different myth structures, and they all have another word that stands in for that word. So for example, in the case of time, one word that elides time but is talking about time is, for example, duration. So what he's doing with Bloch, what he's doing with Finlay, is he's going through these terms, and what he's figuring out is what is the correlative term. So for him, politics, for Finlay, for example, is the word that Finlay uses is invention, but he's talking about the same thing. And so this is where the structuralist linguistics parts comes in, is that he's constructing these. So time here has two. So the original statement is men in time. But we know that time is polysemic because there can be two kinds of time. Time in the past and time in the future, i.e. that there's a procedural point that time has here. That's why it's polysemic. And that's why it's linearly polysemic. Now, the problem is that because it's polysemic on both registers, both time in past and time in future, you're then stuck with how do you bridge these two statements. So let's go back to our first example of page 53. He says, people think, and number two is thought as a relation of the real. There's no way you can actually polysemically derive thought as a relation of the real from people think. There's no way to originally to derive that second statement logically from the first one. It's an independent axiomatic statement. So what you end up there with is, so your poly statement, so you have statement 1 on the top, statement 2 at the bottom. Both of them are heterogeneous multiplicities at this point. The problem with that is, if you make them both heterogeneous multiplicities, you can't actually analyze either. So what you need to do is, and this is the first move he makes with the idea of unicity, is that you want to make one of those statements a unicity, a homogeneous. So from which means that you can then have, if you do it at the level of statement 1, it's at the level of intellectuality. If you do it at the level of statement 2, it's at the level of thinkability. So what you want to do is, on statement 1, make that a unicity, i.e. make it homogeneous. So from there, you can now think statement 2. Because then what that does, though, is you go from statement 1. So the terms to think about, and he does this every time. Yeah. So statement 1, people think. Number 2, the other one is time, and the other one is name. These are 3 you can put on that first level of statements, but in different modes. Now, when you, and then also the unrepeatable. So those are the 4 examples he gives. Statement 2, though, on the level of, that has its own correlation. So for the unrepeatable, it's the break. For people think, it's thought is the relation to the real. Time, it's structure, and then for 4, it's name, and then loci of the name. So all of these are then given from the place of the first statement. The way to combine those statements, though, is by developing what he calls the mode, i.e. by making this one homogeneous, you can then go to the heterogeneous multiplicity of the second statement. From that, and then you can make that thinkable, intellectual, by making it intelligible. By making the statement 2, you can then retroactively look back. That's a reversible back onto statement 1, which then gives you mode. The minute you have that, you have your anthropology of the name. So what that means, though, is, so if you go now to 130, okay. So what that does is, so let us begin by countering the polysemy of time with the unicity of time. So by doing that, you can now see that, on the contrary, there's uniqueness of time when a sequence is not reflected in the problematic of the multiplicity of time. So this is all the stuff that we've just been doing. The category, then on page 130, the category of the possible comes consequently from the unrepeatable, as does the category of heterogeneous historical multiplicities. Thus, the unicity of time is unrepeatable. Then, now, the minute you have a polysemy, at the level of names, if you have a heterogeneous multiplicity there, with that first statement level of statements of heterogeneity is your multiple names. So, what are they? Assad gave them to us very usefully. Revolutionary mode, that's one. The Bolshevik mode, those are the heterogeneous multiples of the categories of the name. Because you have to remember, when you say politics, politics does not have a name. It's an unnameable name. You cannot, when you say Bolshevik mode, the politics of that time, that the politics there are expressed in the Bolshevik political site, but they are not reducible to the Bolshevik political site. The Bolshevik political site is just a placeholder. The word Bolshevik is a placeholder here.
So wait. Let's talk about that, because I think there's a very ambiguous concept he introduces, what he calls singularity.
Yeah, so singularity is thinking, so the singularity is from the position of statement 2, looking reverse back onto statement 1, looking back onto the unnameable name, no longer calling it an unnameable name because you cannot name the unnameable name. So you call it a singularity in thought in relation to yourself. So you can now give it a name, which is that of the category, which is the singularity.
Yeah, that's helpful. I like that. I think that that works very well.
So from Bajurian terms, there's the event, then you have the sequence, that the field that comes out of the event, which is that of the subject. The subject declares fidelity to the event, but by looking back onto that event, has named it, but is no longer talking about the event anymore, but is talking about the category, which is the placeholder for that.
I think that's really helpful. I think another way that might be helpful for people, is to think about this thesis of event or rupture and singularity as not of the order of knowledge, as something which, and people asked in the Slack about law, and I think that there is a common ground here where the singularity is in some ways not a transgression of a law, but it is an autonomous realization of a type of prescriptive politics, which is no longer reliant on an old law. So there's something that is a breaking of the law within a worker's anthropology, but it is localized to that factory. It is a discovery of a relation of the real, which is local to that group of workers. What they then produce can generate something of novelty in a universal sense. And that's what he means by sight, right? So sight is the ethical naming of what is otherwise unnameable.
Oh no,
the name.
No. The site is not. It's not a ethics. It's a place. So for example, it's so the way to think about it is, there's the event. We will now sequentially name it just for the sake of 1917. That event will have sites where that event took manifestation. So and those are political sites. So those political sites are prescriptively, and this is important only in this one instantiation, the party. Now, the problem, this is why the Stalinist mode is an end of that, because what the Stalinist mode does is that it knows sites of the name do not have names. So there is not a named site of the name. The minute you name the site of the name, like Stalin did, i.e. the party, it means that the party now thinks, which means that you've closed that, and it's no longer a space of interiority, it's now a space of exteriority. So a political site for him, and that's why he keeps on insisting, we should not call it the party, but we should call it the political site, because the factory worker is one name, is one term to designate a site of the name, or the party is another. So let me just find it for you.
No, I agree that a site is a place. I think it does have a physicality, no doubt. But what I'm saying is that the ethical revolves around how we assign the novelty of the name. Because in a fascistic mode, or you can have the development of a mode, and then the assigning of the exterior of that name to something like the people's consciousness or to history as such. And this is where you sort of have the invocation of these historians. Simultaneous to that, you have the insistence on a separation from the category of history around the novelty of names within politics, you see? Rather, what I'm saying is the ethical point, and this is something that I'm still trying to think through, is around how one corresponds unnameable names to sites. How does this occur, right? What is the operator?
Well, so the operator is the name. So for there to have been a name, i.e. politics, there must be something must have been given. But that given is not noble in itself. The problem with the problem with history and why you need a separation from history is that history is always for him state-centric. The minute and it always puts the unicity of thought as that around around the state. So if you think about, for example, the missing person as someone who works on the ancients and early modern history, the person who is closest an enemy to Lazarus is Machiavelli, because Machiavelli is doing the same thing. It's all interior to his own thought. All he is doing is going through the historical through a series of anthropological texts, whether it's the Titus of Livy or whatever else. But the difference between Machiavelli and Lazarus is Machiavelli's entire project is to reorient it back to history. The project of history is to capture the state form. Lazarus, and this is where I agree with Assad, is a post-Althusserian thinker. So the way my approach to Lazarus is to place him within competing Althusserianisms of the time. So the first one, it would be, and he takes very particular positions towards them. So the most famous camp he is closest to, although he would disagree with that, is Laclau Mouffe and Henderson Hurst, who move heavily towards a notion of the subjective and the incapacity of thought to become science and gain any approximate knowledge of the real object of knowledge. That perspective has been most adopted by some of Althusser's other students, like, for example, Godelier, or so from the anthropological field, the people he's disagreeing with, i.e. without ever mentioning them, is first, he doesn't start with Jean-Pierre Vernon. He starts with Finlay. That's a very particular choice. So the person who starts with Vernon, for example, is Althusser. And it's actually a sort of very, it's an aleatory understanding of how thought arises and dies. And so if you ever are interested, check out Jean-Pierre Vernon's on the origins of Greek political thought.
Yeah, I love that book.
That's a key book for Althusser. Lazarus abandons that. He's not interested in that. The other ones that he abandons are people like Claude Melessieu, who I mentioned last time, and Maurice Godelier. The reason for that is all of them take a very clear understanding of the object of knowledge, i.e. the modes of production and the relations of production. He's opposing that project, that Althusserian project as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
well, I think that's all very excellent. Yeah.
And he's splitting from the other competitors of his, which are like people like Suzanne Brunhoff and the Agliati and those guys, which do the political economy stuff. And this is why he always mentions law, economics, and history. Those are the three main fields that Althusserians went and did in the 1970s. And he basically is saying, I disagree with every one of these guys, without ever saying that. Yeah. The person that he is closest to with this idea of worker anthropology, ironically, is Jacques Rancière, who because Jacques Rancière also starts fundamentally with the idea that people think, i.e. the project of the ignorant schoolmaster, but even the Proletarian Knight's book is an anthropology basically of workers thinking and writing. So in that way that he starts from a very Rancièrean position. Now, now the problem for him, where he's more developed than Rancière, is that he actually explains why you need, why you can justify going away from the work factory as from being a militant outside of the factory floor, handing out newspapers, which both Rancière and Lazarus basically break from. And the reason that they do that is that they want to basically say that there is a multiplicity of sites of the factory. And where he starts with that is 1966. So, and that's on page 148, 49.
Well, they're not, he doesn't want to say that in the contemporary conjecture, this is my current slide. At the end of 4, he makes a pivot. And I know Danny mentioned this in our chat about the book on Twitter. He makes a pivot from all of these historian-oriented comments about totality and, you know, concepts of time, to really start to analyze them. And then obviously the next chapter, studies, is even more practical. But at the end of 4, he looks at the contemporary conjecture.
Oh, totally.
As I read it, let me just say this point. He's saying something very innocent, let's say, about our current political conjecture, which is that we're not even interested in looking at a mode. We don't even really have a mode that we're latched onto per se. A mode has not begun, right? We rather need worker anthropology in order to investigate a new mode, to investigate places. We have what he calls the sacrificed names, which are leftovers from the Leninist mode of factory and worker. And we begin with them. This is just one thing before you go, Drew.
Yep.
This is a quote from Badiou in the early 2000s, which I think is very relevant to think about the periodization of the investigation of factory worker places. I can just read this. We're in a period of the constitution of a possible evental site. There are not yet events in the philosophical sense of the word, but it is at least the constitution of zones of precariousness, which one can interpret as announcing that something will happen. So I take that to mean that for Lazarus, and it would be very interesting to invoke other militant tendencies which look to insurrectionary forms as possible places of investigation as well, although I don't think that Lazarus is foreclosing those, even though he has a emphasis primarily on the factory. So I thought that might be an interesting point of discussion, which is, yeah, like he's written this when in the early to mid 2000s, right? And I think that it would be interesting to do a kind of inventory around what has taken place within worker investigations. And I know that the final chapter presents some pretty interesting kind of feedback on that. But I just wanted to summarize the conclusion of 4.
Yep.
Go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, so what he starts with is that a starting point of the thesis of a worker is the elapsing of the signifier, which marks the end of an intellectuality. That's page 147. So this has got to do with the question of the worker, and the category of the worker being lapsed, i.e. previously we had other names for them. So we had laborer, we had proletariat, we had employee. Now we have the factory worker, which is this new unnameable name. And the worker here proves the category of worker is actually a circulating element, because the fact that the factory worker is a saturating category means that everyone is talking about what is the state of the worker today, right? If you think about it, for the last, let's be very social science about it for 2 minutes. For the last 30 years in labor studies, the entire focus has been, what is the nature of the worker today, right? Are we the precariat? Are we this? Are we that? That's basically what all we talked about is now that the factory is dying, what is next? So what he's saying is that in 1966, we see the beginning of a new process. And this is...
What year?
1966. And that's on page 149. And for him, the period is going from 1966 to 1981.
Yeah.
So 1966 is he says that with the Shanghai workers taking over the factory there and making political statements was the first time that they create a separation between the factory and the party state. So this is their politics that this is the unnameable name of the factory worker for the first time. He says at the same time, we see a similar kind of breakout in France and Italy. And then he said with the Fiat in 1968 to 1970 on page 149, and Alfa Romeo in Milan. And then he says in France during the worker revolts of 68 to 78. And then finally, in 1981, which is really interesting, is that he includes Soldernowsk. Now, the reason that that's really interesting is that Solzhenitsyn, if you talk to a classical Maoist, would see that as a revisionist example. Why would you ever include Solzhenitsyn? And the fact that he's including Solzhenitsyn is really important because it actually talks about how he sees a saturation of a very particular experience of the Soviet Union. And that's why, for example, Badiou in Obscure Disaster will call the Soviet Union a long-term obscure disaster of the last decades. For them, 1981, if there ever was a last moment, it was 1981. And the reason for that is that in 1981, the factory is also abandoned as a political site. It now becomes society.
Yeah.
Right? And now we're all about that, right? Like if you think about it, from the period from 1981 onwards, you had someone like Thatcher, who said society doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And
well,
then,
that's also why the operators under the Leninist mode had efficacy within society. So you did not have to have a subtractive politics in the way that Lazarus and Badiou insist on it when you were under the Leninist mode, right? And I think the reasons for that are very complex historical reasons about the relationship of autonomy of workers and the efficacy of the operators that Leninism developed. I think what I'm reading into this is that, and I wonder if others agree, is that we don't really have operators. If operators are what are dialectical today, we must be anthropologists in order to derive them or to produce them at places, at sites, you see? Like, you see my point? Like, I wonder if people read it the same way. Like, I really read this as a kind of clean slate, you know, like in some sense, as militants.
I mean, he wouldn't call it a clean slate because for him, the minute you call it a clean slate means...
No, okay, I don't mean clean slate. That's too strong. You're right.
You're right. Because for him, what's fundamentally important is the question of sequence. Now, the reason, for example, that you need to have a homogeneity of time, by doing the move of doing a homogeny of time, the minute you do that, that means you can no longer do comparative analysis.
Right.
So that's why he always says we are not ever going to compare across modes. You will never see him say, let's compare the Leninist mode to the revolutionary mode. That never occurs. What happens is, from the revolutionary mode, there's a closure of that mode, i.e. it's saturated, and then the next mode starts.
Right.
So you will never compare them because there's nothing comparable in them.
Yeah.
There are elements that have been completely transformed. So now, are we in a mode? He would argue that yes, we are in some mode, which was started by the Mitterrand project. Because for him, with Mitterrand and the attack on the immigrant, you basically see the rise of a new factory site, which is not the factory in our classical conception of, you know, of a car factory. But now he's saying it's the sans-papier guy, the figure of the worker in the figure of the sans-papier.
Right, those without papers, yeah.
Those without papers. They are constantly now in the new kind of figure in this site.
And this movement of Badiou and Lazarus has ended, by the way.
Yeah.
So
they fundamentally split on the question of what is the mode, right?
Well, I think you have to realize that when Badiou produces a book called The Rebirth of History, where he locates the Arab Spring as equivalent to 1848 worker revolts, you know you have something novel, or you see, you know what I mean? Like you have a new mode, a new wager at periodization. So, you know, I wonder how committed we are in this group to taking Lazarus's rather inflexible discussion of modes. And I think Assad mentioned that as well, that there's a certain, you know, there's only 4 of them, for example. I wonder how much we can elongate or elasticize or apply the Lazarus framework to modes which we perceive as novel.
I'm very curious about what is on everybody else's mind. And I wonder if we could just have a few seconds of awkward silence in which, you know, then someone may speak up and we can hear a little bit about what everyone's thinking about.
Great idea. I hear birds chirping. That's very nice. Somebody must be outside.
Oh, that's me.
Hey, welcome.
Hey,
How are you?
I'm sorry to be late. I've got computer problems here.
No worries.
I do have a question that I jumped a little bit ahead in his text because sometimes I find it's good to get the general architecture of where we're going, and it cleared some things up for me. But I wonder if somebody could speak to a little bit what he really means by singularities. He does touch on it later as being potentially problematic insofar as it could potentially invite a kind of let's say a working process whereby anyone's mode of politics, political thinking, or political relation to the real, as he might want to put it, would be something, or would be a kind of verbiage or lexicon that you could enter into in its own right. But then if I remember it right, and I only read it quickly, he argues that there's a way that it doesn't become this kind of wildly pluralistic, I'm sorry to say this, but sort of multiverse opening to any kind of organization of political thought, which I'm just a little concerned that it does leave that door open to, say, conspiracy theory, to any kind of way of organizing agitation from a subjective point of view. So how does singularity, in the way that he's defining it, not have this problem of sort of giving ontological merit to any organization of signifiers in a political relation to the real?
Great point. Anybody want to comment? Yeah, like what is Lazarus's theory of fascism? I mean, can you have a yeah, it's an interesting point, but I don't know if others want to jump in there. I have thoughts on this, Andrew, but I want to invite others as well. Because I mean, singularity is not developed in politics in exteriority, right? So immediately right there, you eliminate most forms of politics, and you sort of localize what he means by it by his form of thinking, by this form of thinking politics, which is rare and which is sequential, right? And
Right.
you almost need like Badiou's little book Ethics to sort of be able to differentiate subjective positions of reaction, of obscurity, and so on within that context. I think that that's a fair point. You need a kind of I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at. I was invoking the thesis after reading Andrew Kolb's very provocative book called Dark Deleuze, where he argues for a left-wing mobilization of conspiracy inspired by Deleuze's thought, as a way to, because if the side of the consensual, as Lazarus calls it in our time, is completely inefficacious, is producing fascism, yeah, I don't know, it's something to think about, right?
Yeah.
I have a question for Drew, if I might.
Go for it.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the sort of distinction that you made between Lazarus and Machiavelli, because my only entry point into these discussions is through Althusser and my reading of Althusser, and I've been reading Machiavelli and Us recently. And I put in the notes not so long ago that I'm noticing a similarity between the kind of project that Machiavelli was trying, as Althusser explains it, and what Lazarus is trying here, which is a point that you kind of made, which cleared that up for me. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, like on Althusser's reading of Machiavelli, and like whether or not there's an opposition between that and Lazarus, or whether he bridges that gap. I don't know, like that would be interesting.
So I'm just going to say that like I have 300 pages on Althusser and Machiavelli, and it's because I don't think that there's one Althusser and Machiavelli. So in my own work on Althusser and Machiavelli, I actually identify 5 different interpretations Althusser gives of Machiavelli, and and there's a whole thing of periodization I do of Althusser's work. So I would say that the furthest removed from a Machiavelli that's applicable to Lazarus would be the one you're reading now. Insofar that I don't see in Lazarus any idea of like the aleatory, like you could read the aleatory through Badiou as a singularity, which is definitely one way people have read Althusser, and I think that that's the sort of Althusser-Badiou nexus that I think many people have become really familiar with. But when I look at Lazarus, I don't, so I actually asked Lazarus, where's Machiavelli in your thought? Because I met him once for 3-4 hours in Paris. He has a lovely house in South Paris. And he's a really nice guy. Like I'll make it very clear. He's weird, but he's a really nice guy. And for him, he actually said like Machiavelli. He was kind of stunned. He's like, Machiavelli has no place for me, and I think that's because Machiavelli for him is so objectal and so and especially through Althusser is so directed towards the state that the similarities between their respective projects regarding the question of reading is really uncomfortable and I think so. I don't want to take up time with this because I don't think it's relevant to our understanding of the work today. But I think that where I do have certain questions are about the choices he makes, right? He provides no explanation why I should not be into the parliamentary mode. He says that we shouldn't be into the parliamentary mode because that's state-oriented. But as someone who lives and makes a living doing politics, if I told my employer, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about the parliament anymore, I'm going to just talk about workers' anthropology of our membership, I would be fired in about half an hour. They'd be like, no, get your ass over to talking about the state, man. So I have real questions about whether, and this goes to your question, sorry, AFS, what is your full name? Sorry, Andrew, right? So my question is, does this not—
I'm Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. My question is this: does this politics not lead to a sectarianism where you say Trotsky's Fourth International was the unnameable name? I now have a moment of a site of a name called the Fourth International. I then retrospectively look back on the singularity, which was, let's say, Trotsky's Permanent Revolution book. And now I've set up a mode for myself. And now I can just keep justifying. I can keep saying, like, I'm not the Stalinist mode. And it's completely interior to my subjective thought. Does this not, could not Lazarus just justify every microsect in the world and call it politics?
I don't think so, though. I want to know what others think. But doesn't he address that in his critique of Stalin, about how Stalin took the novelty of Leninism? It was not arbitrary, and it's about I guess, yeah, that also raises the question: is within a mode, the sites that are selected for relevance or pertinence or novelty. Also, there's I want to say ethical consideration that may be overlooked by Lazarus. That's how I read your question.
I mean, I'm, as someone who does Machiavelli, ethics interests me not. I'm not interested at all in ethics. I'm interested completely in politics. And so there's the first thing is his definition of politics. Do people buy it? His definition of politics is that it's evental, and it can only be understood retrospectively through the singularity and the mode. Do people in this group, the reading group, find that to be a satisfactory understanding of politics?
Let's pose the question differently.
Yeah, sure.
Let's ask this. Insofar as we have an interest in emancipatory politics, let's just posit that we have an interest in emancipatory politics. Do we believe that it can be understood on the basis of a social foundation? Which is, for example, you'll find it everywhere in the contemporary discussion of Marxism and socialism and so on, that a politics is emancipatory insofar as it's an expression of the social foundation of the relations of production. Is this an adequate way of thinking of emancipatory politics? I mean, to me, this is a very practical question, actually, which is what his work is all about.
Isn't he kind of saying no? I mean, if you skip ahead to the area where he discusses the French Revolution and the importance of the French Revolution in his conceptualization, which I feel like is very clear there, in opposition to the way he's done a really strong job, in my view, of defining the Leninist party state modality, and Marx's, he differentiates that whole, which he returns to a number of times, Marx's approach of the worker versus the upper class, basically, or the capitalist class, and then the party state concept from Lenin on. And he kind of is rejecting both, obviously, and arguing pretty strongly, it seems to me, pretty directly for, it's almost remarkably Hegelian, frankly, for a notion of the role of institutions, of forming institutional structures that are somewhat trans-historical and trans-political. Does that make him a liberal? I don't know, but I suddenly was like, wow, this really is outside of the usual way of a Marxist, conception, or it struck me that way. I don't know.
Definitely not a Marxist. Like, I think that's one thing we should put to bed, is that he sees Marxism as a saturated form of thought. Like, for example, when he talks about the factory worker, he clearly states we're no longer talking about labor theory of value as a justification for the worker being our main figure. So I think that Assad's question, and the head of his article, can socialists think, is the correct one for him, because he's definitely committed to an emancipatory politics, which you could maybe collectively call the socialist, but he's not a Marxist insofar that he's no longer attached to any of those object-subject relationships which one would take from a. So for him, his Althusserian rationalism, from Althusser he takes a rationalism, but he doesn't take a rationalist understanding of the labor theory of value, which he calls for in Reading Capital.
I just think that, obviously the text is extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily complex, so we can get stuck in the weeds with a lot of it. But you can pull out certain statements which are absolutely clear and set out an absolutely explicit and controversial position, which we can discuss directly. Politics is rare and sequential. This is a very clear statement, and it's very contrary. The personal is political. It's absolutely against the idea that the personal is political. You cannot have these thoughts at once. So, I mean, what do we make of that? The idea that an emancipatory politics is not founded on the historical laws which make the proletariat the subject of history. Very controversial claim coming in the history of Marxism. I mean, incredible. I mean, let's see, or, you know, I just had this argument the other day with Jody Dean at an event for Red May. I said we have to think of forms beyond the party, new political forms of organization beyond the party. She said, well, you know, intellectuals always say we should think about it and blah, blah, blah. Well, what about the point that people think? What if the foundation of politics is that people think and not just intellectuals think?
And
I mean, these are
actually,
very clear political statements, I think. Yeah.
yeah,
Taylor.
I wanted to say, I mean, I agree with you. And I think one way to kind of maybe, I don't know, maybe the way I'm kind of trying to interpret Drew's question is in relation to Lazarus and Marxism is Lazarus not taking very seriously the sort of crisis of Marxism statement of Althusser? And is he not thinking in an incredibly extreme and Althusserian way, which is to say, if Marxism is not theoretically up to the task of dealing with Stalinism, of dealing with the developments of the 20th century, then perhaps it's necessary, especially when we can look at the problems in Stalinist organizational forms, or even the parliamentary organizational forms that Balabar talks about in actually the Viewpoint translations that Assad and Patrick King did. You know, also, it seems that Lazarus is kind of accepting in some weird sense this end of history concept. I mean, I don't want to say that in too controversial a way, but essentially accepting in some sense this problem or at least willing to entertain, or at least take as a starting point, the idea that Marxism is in a sense foreclosed, to return to some notion of, well, then where do we find those political forms? Where do we find the kind of next genesis or genealogy of a political sequence? And is it that not going to be in the fact that people think, not that the intellectuals think or the masses think or whatever, is that it orients us toward some unknown that we have to go find and deal with, right? I guess that's kind of a way that I'm trying to, I don't know, I'm not really exactly asking a question. Maybe someone can help me sharpen that, but this is kind of where I think that we may kind of be seeing something. And just to Assad's point, I'm sorry, that the axiom of people think, that this is in a lot of ways what we're invoking, that people think is this, you can tie people think to Althusser's kind of extreme statement of the crisis of Marxism. That's I guess what I'm trying to suggest.
My only, if I could direct respond to that, because it's really provocative, and I have very little like reference to other writings basically between Marx and Lazarus. I'm very naive on this. So, but to your point, into this idea that Althusser is trying to, I think someone said it earlier, revive or kind of reinterpret the Stalinist mode in a way that's useful. I wonder if what you just said, Taylor, that Marxism kind of he's using Marxism within the Stalinist mode to kind of show, I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, but to show that Marxism has like fully saturated and lapsed, if there is a way to leapfrog or kind of take, as we would with any other mode, Marxism applied in Stalinism and still not conclude or make a decision not to conclude that Marxism is fully saturated. Do we need to, so, but that's just thought, reaction.
I mean, obviously there's people who are far more, schooled and studied in Althusser and everything, but I mean, my sort of kind of interpretation of of what that question is I think that, you know, Althusser's project with For Marx and Reading Capital is, if we want to call it that Stalinist revisionism, it's a way of trying to combat a particular moment. And it's why he gets immediately kind of thrown out of the PCF, right? I mean, he's kind of at war with them from the beginning. So the fact that Althusser then, over a decade later, then makes the claim of the crisis of Marxism, it seems like that's an evolution in Althusser's thought, which is that, you know, he is in some way shifting in his sort of to a different level, right? Which is that, you know, I don't know, I guess maybe Assad or Drew could maybe try to take that, but I guess I would say that, I guess my point is that trying to say that Althusser is kind of from the beginning trying to struggle with the sort of, you know, Stalinist problematic or Stalinist kind of situation. And if he's now moving all the way to point out that Marxism is a limited theory, already trying to point out that it can't actually account for the developments of the 20th century, then to me it seems that Lazarus is accepting the idea that, okay, if Marxism is theoretically limited, well then why, like, let's take an extreme position and just put it all to the side, I guess. I don't know if I'm...
So there are two moments where you can see this relating to Althusser. First of all, I completely agree with you, Taylor, that the crisis of Marxism for him is key for the saturation process being described. And Althusser said it himself, right? Like earlier he was doing a philosophy for Marxism, and now he was doing now he's coming up with the aleatory, the philosophy of the aleatory philosophy, right? So Althusser himself abandons the project of from 1960 till about 1980. He basically abandons that project. Now, the question though is, for Althusser, why he sees Althusser as making the first move to the subjective has got to do with the move that Althusser does in his self-criticism, and in the comment, in the last instance, but the last instance never comes. So in the last instance was meant to be Althusser gesturing to materialism. Guys, I'm not falling into idealism. I still have the economy. But because he wants to have this heavy emphasis on overdetermination, it never comes. I.e., you can never actually have that instantiated moment where the economy is that last instance. It's already overdetermined with all the other processes, biological processes, cultural processes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the problem is that for Althusser, you're stuck with the object-subject relationship of the classist phase. I.e., for Althusser, if you remember your 4 Marx and you remember your Reading Capital, it's got to do with the relationship between the real object and the object of knowledge. The minute you introduce the distinction between real object and object of knowledge, you introduce what we call in the philosophy of science an ontological gap. Now, people like Eric Olin Wright and that sort of camp of Althusser, post-Althusserian Marxism, have tried to reduce that ontological gap through the processes of formalization of mathematics, game theory, etc., like Romer and all of those guys. They're trying to break down that ontological gap. Where Lazarus is offering a very different move, but very similar to the Laclauan move and to Henderson-Hurst, two other variations of Althusserianism, post-Althusserianism, is that they make it completely subjective. The distinction, though, between Lazarus, which makes him distinctive from the other post-Althusserians, is that Laclauan moved to a notion of the social, first of all, as their main agent of change. The site of the political site becomes the social, something that Lazarus rejects here. And number 2, still for someone like Laclauan move, the state is still an object of politics. It's not just anything and everything. And that's the same for Henderson-Hurst. So that's why what Lazarus is doing is quite distinct from the rest of the Althusserian tradition. But I agree with you fundamentally that it's been written from the perspective of the crisis of Marxism. And that's why, like, the dates are 1979, 1980, 81, right? Like, the reason he's given those dates is that in 80-81, you have Poland, which in the given, is this moment of saturation. And conceptually, as you said, from the famous 1979 lecture.
So it's been voiced in the chat just a little bit. I was wondering if the participants wouldn't mind rehearsing some of the, I don't know, the points regarding this debate around the rarity of politics. I know this was kind of a source of no little discomfiture during the first session. I believe Daniel connected it to a kind of faulty reading of Badiou and the event, you know, something almost kind of providential intervening from the outside. So yeah, I don't know if anyone want to go at that, because that just, I don't know, seems like a sensitive point.
Yeah, Robin has been talking about that in the chat as well. Perhaps you can jump in. There's a highly practical, experimental mode of worker anthropology that we're presented in this book. That's still politics, that's still doing politics, right? The fact that the political, kind of going back to this Schmittian thesis of the political and all of the interesting resonances around naming the political and the impossibility of naming the political for both Lazarus and Badiou and other left-wing Schmittians. And I think in some sense they can be read as left-wing Schmittians. It does not mean, nor should it ever mean, that novelty within politics is rare. I think that's not necessarily true. I think it's rather that being at the precipice of a saturated mode and the development of a new iteration of history, that's the rarity part. But sort of, we shouldn't read this as a kind of, I don't know, I'm reading a lot about like council communism after '68, which was this sort of disengaged form of communist activity, which was just going in and finding out what people do that are workers, even though you yourself may not be a worker in a factory. And that the notion was to circumvent the vanguard problematic, right, of the intellectual, which Assad has mentioned as well. So I sense a little bit of that in Lazarus as well. In other words, one can kind of read this text and find political novelty in actually discovering process 1 and process 2 within a factory site. And that's useful, right? That doesn't mean that we have to, like that itself is a political act. Anyways, I'm just thinking out loud, but Robin, perhaps you wanted to jump in.
I guess I have a slightly different view in that, at least as I read this, Lazarus has a concept of politics that seems to rule out what we might refer to as the political. That in fact, I think that it's striking that he doesn't use that formulation, the political, because my own sense is that the political is either sort of wrapped up in a mode of doing politics that is saturated, or has the tendency to treat politics in this from the perspective of its exteriority, right? And so I actually think that maybe I have a somewhat different view of this than, I mean, maybe in other respects it would be fair to call him left-wing Schmittian, I'm not sure. But here, I think that that even, I mean, for me, what's the tension to hold is this idea of the rarity of politics, which is a thesis that you get precisely from those with a concept of the political. And what's interesting for me, right, and so you could think about sort of Arendt or Schmidt or Sheldon Wolin, and you could just sort of proliferate the examples of thinkers who will invoke the political, right, also in connection with the alleged rarity of politics. And what for me is sort of interesting and maybe more promising about Lazarus, even as I said in the chat, I'm not that's the sort of part of Lazarus that I stumble on. I appreciate the extent to which it's not bound up with a kind of objectified formulation of the political, but is very much interested in the doing of politics, right? But not the political as apprehended from a space of exteriority to it. So maybe that's just a somewhat like different read, and both are certainly plausible, I think, on the basis of this pretty obscure text. But I think on that point, maybe it would be helpful to distinguish between politics and the political, and also getting back to Assad's question concerning the sort of emancipatory, prescriptive dimension here, as a certain kind of critique of that kind of reified conception of the political. I don't know.
Isn't I think the saturated mode thing is rare, but isn't the claim also that a politics of the prescriptive is also rare? So that may be problematic. Maybe that's the point that's the most problematic. I mean, I get the importance of the prescriptive as a discursive orientation to thought, as this kind of, you know, subjective confidence that workers and groups formulate around the reiteration and the kind of reversibility of their own freedom and the generation of all of that. I get, but to call that rare, I don't think that's necessary to call that rare. I think prescriptive politics can be, so maybe rarity is at a different level.
I guess I would also I just also would want to say that that the whole idea of the political, I think, is bound to something that he's quite explicitly not invoking, which is the concept, right? The sort of, it is about the concept of the political, and here is where I think there is a really important but sort of implicit critique of Althusser, because I think whatever we might want to say about how Lazarus is inheriting the Althusserian, a certain kind of post-Althusserian problematic, what he quite clearly dispenses with turns out to be centrally important to Althusser's whole project, which is concepts, which is philosophy, right? Like, and that's the sort of the basis for his attachment to philosophy. And I take the anthropology of the name to have a kind of secret polemical object, which is the concept, right? That, like, the polemical object here that is implicitly refuted in the anthropology of the name is the philosophy of the concept, right? Among other things. I mean, also a science of the concept, right? But I think, but more sort of restrictively, the philosophy of the concept. And it seems to me, whether you look at Schmidt, right, who describes his own elaborations on the concept of the political as a kind of sociology of the concept, right, that in many of these elaborations of the political, there is a kind of explicit articulation of the importance of the concept. And so I think that, right, not to get like too heady and too, right, taking Lazarus onto a philosophical terrain that he wishes we would escape from, right, but I think there's significant stakes here in a certain kind of surrendering of the concept. And so for me, I guess I might want to reformulate Assad's question about emancipatory politics, right? Not only in terms of its rarity, but whether emancipatory politics ought to do without the concept, without concepts, right? And this is maybe also where I see Lazarus's project is really sort of explicitly anti-Hegelian, right? Explicitly sort of anti a whole sort of tradition of thinking sort of about emancipatory politics and what sort of it requires. The name, not just the name, right, but name / category seems to be a kind of refutation of the primacy of the concept in sort of left thinking.
This is kind of jumping from there a little bit, but something that's like bugged me a lot in this idea, especially of the worker factory and the Shanghai dialecticization of the worker relation, in this sort of what seems to be an anti-Hegelian way. Can anybody speak to what exactly the form of this de-dialecticized is? Because it's something that comes up in Badiou as well, but like I've only been able to index it to like the mathematical maybe. But it seems like Lazarus, though critical of Hegel, is coming somewhat imminently within his frame, and it's just tough for me to get any sense of what's like not dialectical when you avow at least something of an avowal of dialectics as such. Like what then can appear as de-dialecticized, I guess.
Interesting. What was the page reference to the Shanghai reference? Is that in chapter 4?
Somebody who knows something about want to comment on what he says about Shanghai?
Yeah, so page,
around like 150.
If you go to page 154, he says of de-dialectization of the terms society, state, and party. The de-dialectization is basically an operation in which you decide not to put two terms into a dialectical relationship with one another. The minute you put them into a dialectical relationship with the state, you're then in a mode of exteriority. That's why he's wanting to de-dialecticize that, so that there's not a shuttling back and forth of your intellectuality between those two. Because he immediately is asked the question, well, buddy, you just said political sites are legitimate. Why can't you, because of their relationship to prescription, right? So then the question is, why can't the political site, that is the name which you've now conceptually, categorically named the party, why can it not then relate to the state through prescription rather than through the process of being named? And he immediately says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And the reason he can't do that is the minute you allow for that, you open up the possibility of a parliamentary mode. You're confusing modes at that point because it's then moving from one set of axiomatic statements to the next. So this works. His system works, but by accepting a series of procedures which are deeply suspicious. And I think anyone who here wants to become a Lazarusian is going to have to come up with is going to have to work a little bit to further develop this architecture, because I think that this is going to get poked a lot.
I want to check in on time. It's 20.
Chris said something, Chris.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
You're muted.
Go ahead.
We still can't hear you.
Can't hear you. Maybe unplug your headphones.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so on the de-dialectization in Shanghai question, he writes on 152 that it consists in separating the working masses from the state and party. So this makes the factory a place for politics, because the workers' relation, the workers' initial relation to party/state is severed, and the factory becomes a site of transformation into something, and this is what was going on in the Shanghai days in 1966. The factory becomes something other than a place of production, and it expands into many areas of life. So this is a site of politics, and I think that that's what that's the sort of crux of where de-dialecticization is. I also wanted to mention that he, it's interesting, and this is in relation to the rarity of politics. When he talks about his 1989 workers' investigation in Canton, in China, and it's important to him to specify that that's a time when he says that China isn't capitalist. Then I think that's a legitimate legitimate position, and this might sort of clarify where his analysis is, because many people who found that workers in 1989 in Chinese factories talked about money all the time, and money was a sort of determinant for them. The conclusion, the explanation of this was, now China has gone capitalist. Lazarus does not say that. He says that, the factory becomes a site of money. And what money represents is another situation of withdrawal of workers from the party state. And I would say that's an instance, that withdrawal, that de-dialecticization under the sign of money is a non-political or unpolitical moment of de-dialecticization. So de-dialecticization doesn't guarantee a politics, but I think it maintains, and workers think doesn't guarantee a politics. I mean, I think his explanation of 1989, of Chinese workers in 1989, is a more productive one, a more potentially prescriptive one than the kind of China has gone capitalist that pervaded at that time.
Thank you for that intervention. That was really good. It's 25 after our time for concluding, and it's Saturday night, so I don't want to keep people can go, but I do want to invite any burning questions. Cade has another question. Cade, do you want to verbalize your point?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm still caught up with this de-dialecticization process, because I can understand, like, okay, if you have this then worker factory or worker money relation, it de-dialecticizes the worker from the state or the worker from the party, but then doesn't it form its own dialectic between the worker and money, or the worker and the factory?
I think can you hear me now? Am I audible? Okay. I think that money became, money, the thought of money, the anthropology of the thought of money, or actually the factory is a site of money, is still a site of withdrawal from the party state. I mean, I think the de-dialecticization, my point is simply that to consider these two moments, 1966 and 1989, is to illustrate both the rarity of politics and maybe the nature of thought in a after a mode has been saturated.
Great. Next week we're going to meet for kind of presentations under the theme of application of Lazarus to today. I know Assad has something. Gabriel, who facilitated last time, has a case study, a Lazarusian case study. I'll have a short presentation. Robin will have a presentation. If anybody else has a presentation that they would like to offer on Lazarus, just send me an email. We want to keep them short and punchy. We didn't get a chance to meet to talk about the final chapter. I recognize that. I'm somewhat limited to what our original plan was, and I kind of want to stick to that plan. We also have two more senior scholars that have expressed interest in giving talks. Bruno Bostiels, who actually joined us last time, and Michael Neocosmos. So Neocosmos is one of the most important African Lazarusians, if I could use that phrase. And I've asked him if he could come and give us a very practical overview of how he's applied Lazarus, sort of lessons from that experience. And it looks like he'll do it. I think so. Fingers crossed. So yeah, that's our plan. And then Lazarus may come and give a talk to us as well. He's been invited. If he can come, that would be fabulous. I'll keep everybody updated on that. Anything else for the good of the whole before we go? No? Good. Great conversation, everyone. I really, really had a nice time today. I will post the video for those who couldn't make it. All the best. Bye-bye.